stop everything. Over the past 50 years, the West has poured more than $1.2 trillion into Africa in humanitarian and financial aid. To put this in perspective, it is a volume of wealth greater than the combined GDP of nations like Spain, Australia, or South Korea. This colossal effort should have transformed the continent, but the reality is a punch in the stomach. When this aid began, only 11% of Africa lived in poverty, but in the 1990s, after the massive flood of money and global campaigns, this figure exploded to 66%. And today, it stands at 38%, a poverty rate that is more than 3 times the starting point. The paradox is deeper. In the 1950s, the average European was 5 times richer than the African. Today, this difference has more than doubled to 13 times. More than half of Africans still struggle to survive on less than $5.50 a day, and 600 million people live without access to electricity. The West has always had the same simplistic answer. They are poor because they do not have enough money, and to solve this, we just need to give more. And that is exactly what we have done. Since the 1960s, the amount of aid to Africa has increased almost 120 times. It is easy to understand the emotional appeal of this strategy. It makes us imagine schools, roads, and vaccinated children, the same model of the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. But in Africa, the model does not work. Many point to colonialism, the inevitable rise of dictators and corruption, and while fleets of luxury cars and presidential jets, while 30% of the continent suffers without clean water, are disgusting, the investigation goes further. A growing body of research is revealing the shocking truth that donated money isn't just being wasted. It's actually poisoning the continent, making Africa poorer. The naked truth is that decades of Western involvement may be the only obstacle standing in the way of Africa's real development. This is how aid laid the foundation for the greatest humanitarian failure of the Moderna for a time. This foreign aid was seen as a magic bullet to eradicate poverty, and this belief had grounds. In the 1960s, the success of the Marshall Plan proved that it worked. After World War II, with Europe decimated and communism gaining ground, the geopolitical risk was immense. For the U.S., the threat of Western Europe falling to the USSR was a disaster. Thus, in 1947, the government launched the ambitious Marshall Plan, injecting more than $13 billion, about $160 billion today, into Europe between 1948 and 1952. The idea was that by providing large amounts of money to Europe, America could kickstart investment in the economy. And surprisingly, it worked. In the decade after the Marshall Plan, GDP per capita in the region grew by almost 35%. For the Western world, this was a massive success. But for America, it also represented a turning point. She realized that through aid, she could make countries rich and, in doing so, create both new trading partners and long-term allies in the fight against communism. Thus, after the success of the Marshall Plan, the U.S. turned its eyes to another continent, Africa. At the time, the continent was still recovering from centuries of colonialism. In 1960, the average income in sub-Saharan Africa was less than $150 a year, and literacy rates were less than 30%, with life expectancy hovering around 45 years. Most of the continent had no paved roads, electricity grids, or functioning governments. But it also had something America wanted: natural resources. The continent possessed vast reserves of oil, copper, diamonds, and rare minerals. And with a rapidly growing population, it was seen as a future economic giant. If America could repeat the success of the Marshall Plan, it could unlock a new economic frontier and build a key ally in the process. So the money began to flow. In the 1960s, sub-Saharan Africa received $500 million in aid every year, but by the 1990s, that number had increased 40-fold to nearly $20 billion. Africa quickly became the most aid-dependent region on Earth. And in the 1990s, aid money accounted for more than 60% of government budgets in countries like Uganda, Mali, and Burkina Faso. But despite this massive injection of money, things were getting worse. In fact, from 1970 to 2000, the average income in Africa decreased, despite receiving almost $600 billion during this period. But instead of changing the approach, the West doubled down. In 2005, the UN launched the Millennium Development Goals, and the G8 pledged to double aid to Africa, with the goal of ending poverty by 2030. This was no longer just a government strategy. It had become a public movement. Campaigns such as Comic Relief in the UK, Live Aid and Band-Aids Feed the World have turned Africa into a moral crusade. Ordinary citizens were donating millions, schools held fundraisers, and celebrities sang charity songs, all under the belief that sending money would solve the problem. All of this created a powerful narrative that poverty in Africa was not about politics, corruption, or bad governance. It was simply about lack of money, and if we gave enough, we could solve that problem. In 2010, aid flows to Africa reached more than $50 billion a year, the highest level in history. However, nearly 2 decades later, these efforts have failed dramatically. 400 million Africans still live on less than $2 a day, the highest number in history, and the continent's share of global trade remains below 3%. And many countries are now poorer than they were in the 1980s. All of this begs the rather obvious question: why has aid succeeded in boosting the European economy, but utterly failed to do the same in Africa? As always, a range of ideas was proposed, from the geography of the continent to its colonial history. But in recent years, one school of thought has gained particular attention among development experts. Their idea is simple. Everything can be explained by something that economists call institutions. These are the frameworks that govern societies, things like the rule of law, property rights, and democracy. And they may be the most important factor in explaining why aid may be making things worse in Africa. When the Marshall Plan began, Western Europe had the infrastructure of functioning states. Ministries, legal systems, and public institutions, although damaged, had existed for decades. These institutions provided the necessary framework for reconstruction. They could collect taxes, distribute resources, and enforce laws, all functions essential to a stable and functioning society. But in much of Africa, the picture was very different. Most African states had recently gained independence, and governments were either newly formed or inherited from colonial administrations. But in both cases, institutions were usually designed for a single purpose: to extract wealth. Unlike most Western democracies, states functioned almost entirely to serve the interests of the ruling elite. Indexes that track the quality of government institutions have consistently found African countries near the bottom of the list. In 2025, African nations accounted for almost half of the 30 worst countries in the democracy ranking. It's not hard to imagine why pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into these states goes wrong. The money that was supposed to fund roads, schools, hospitals, and electrification often goes directly into the hands of ruling elites. Presidents flying in private jets to international conferences, or government ministers seen wearing $60,000 Rolex watches during anti-poverty meetings. Estimates suggest that the continent loses about $30 billion every year to corruption and 30% of all aid money it has received in the past 50 years. This could add up to hundreds of billions of dollars stolen. But the problem is not only that this money is effectively being wasted, it also actively supports the very institutions that make development so difficult. In a normal democracy, governments are financed through taxes, and this creates a two-way relationship between the state and the people. When people pay taxes, they expect services in return, and if the ruling class fails to provide them, it risks the people demanding a new government. But in aid-dependent countries, this accountability mechanism is broken. Since governments receive funding from foreign donors, it doesn't really matter what the people of the country think. And so corruption manages to persist with very little domestic resistance. This sums up the continent's political process over the past 50 years. Take Malawi, for example. At various times in the 2000s and early 2010s, foreign aid accounted for more than 40% of the national budget, but huge amounts of money were being stolen by government officials, paying for things like luxury cars, private homes, or even international shopping trips. You might expect a scandal to trigger mass outrage. After all, The government was embezzling millions that were supposed to serve the public, but that simply never happened. Because government funding came from foreign sources, the people most affected by the mismanagement of public funds, the citizens of Malawi, had very little power to demand systemic change. This is not unique to Malawi. The same dynamic has been going on across the continent for decades, and that partly explains why the country still has such high levels of corruption. Of course, some level of corruption exists in virtually every country, especially during its early stages of development. But even under these circumstances, a country can usually still achieve economic development. Small businesses, farmers, and entrepreneurs can drive progress from the ground up, creating jobs and expanding access to goods and services without relying heavily on the state. But this is another of the main problems with aid. It makes the groundwork much more difficult because aid makes this path of development much less likely. That's because most of the time, the things provided by aid organizations are in direct competition with local businesses. Look at the textile industry. In the early 2000s, nearly 80% of clothing sold in some African nations came from abroad. At first glance, this may seem like a win-win. Clothes were cheap, and aid organizations felt good about reducing waste in Western countries. But the effect on local African industry was devastating. In Ghana alone, more than 80% of home textile factories closed between 1990 and 2010, which meant the disappearance of thousands of jobs and, with them, the knowledge, machines, and networks needed to sustain a local industry. In fact, over the past 2 decades, Africa's industrial sector has shrunk from 15% of the continent's economy to now just 10%. This is no coincidence. Academic research has found that, on average, foreign aid undermines industrialization in Africa. Even the World Bank, one of the world's largest aid organizations, has found that periods of increased aid tend to weaken local production. But it's not just domestic industries that suffer. The entire structure of the economy can be distorted in ways that make economic growth much less likely. To understand why, it is useful to look at how countries actually get rich. In recent decades, almost all countries that have achieved rapid development have done so through an export-driven model. Nations such as South Korea, Taiwan, and China have seen huge amounts of economic growth in recent decades, and have done so by offering low-cost goods that appeal to Western consumers and then selling them on international markets. Over time, this allowed them to industrialize, build domestic industries, and eventually move up the value chain. But there is one essential part of the process that people tend to forget: maintaining a weak currency. Doing so makes the country's exports cheaper in the global market, increasing demand from foreign buyers. This increased demand then helps local industries grow, creating jobs and bringing in valuable foreign revenues, further boosting development. But aid money creates the opposite effect. When money flows into the country, it needs to be converted into the local currency so that governments and aid organizations can actually spend it. But doing so increases the price of the currency in foreign exchange markets in response to increased demand. Having a more valuable currency may not seem like a bad thing, but it actually causes a serious problem. A more expensive currency means that for foreigners trying to buy the country's products, everything suddenly becomes more expensive. Consequently, people simply stop buying the products. For developing economies, this is a total disaster. It means that the export-driven model, which works so successfully in East Asia, becomes impossible to replicate in Africa. Today, exports account for about 20% of average GDP, less than half of most successful East Asian economies, such as Hong Kong, South Korea, or Taiwan. Instead of developing competitive industries and shipping products around the world, aid-dependent countries end up relying on foreign assistance to survive, while their domestic economies remain uncompetitive and underdeveloped. Of course, that doesn't mean aid can't bring benefits. In theory, it has the potential to fill crucial gaps in development. Things like building roads, schools, and power grids, all facilitating domestic economic expansion. But this brings us to the final and potentially most serious issue of foreign aid. It is almost never delivered effectively, A 2012 report by the Center for Global Development found that up to 70% of aid projects failed to meet their goals or had no measurable impact. In some sectors, the waste has been staggering. An audit of health aid in Uganda found that nearly a third of donated medical supplies never reached their intended recipients, lost due to theft, mismanagement, or simple logistical failure. In Haiti, after the 2010 earthquake, billions in aid flowed, but less than 10% reached local institutions. Most of it was channeled through foreign contractors, NGOs, or indirect costs. And more than a decade later, many communities still lack basic sanitation or permanent housing. To understand why, it's helpful to look at systems that work effectively. Think of a business that operates in a competitive market. If it provides a bad product, consumers will simply switch to its competitors, and the company's revenues will fall. And if it does not make changes, it may even go bankrupt. The central issue, the breaking point of the whole system, lies in the breakdown of responsibility. In a functioning market, providers are directly accountable to consumers. Failure means bankruptcy. But foreign aid operates in a moral vacuum. If a project fails in Africa, recipients have no veto or voting power to punish the foreign donor. Funding does not come from the people, but from external capital. This eliminates any incentive mechanism for excellence. There is no reward for success and no punishment for inefficiency. The inevitable result is a chronic lack of motivation to execute projects correctly. So the story of aid in Africa cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of failure. It is a document of fundamentally flawed assumptions. What began as a noble effort to eradicate poverty has turned upside down, spawning systems of chronic dependency, eroding state institutions, and ruthlessly choking local industries with unfair competition. It is vital to recognize that aid is crucial in times of total collapse, during famines, conflicts, or natural disasters, offering emergency and vital relief. But as a long-term development strategy, the numbers are a judgment impossible to ignore. Aid has betrayed the promise of transformation. If the real and lasting goal is to forge self-sustaining growth, the focus must be shifted radically from palliative handouts to the building of unbreakable institutions, the decisive boost to domestic enterprises, and the creation of a system where governments are accountable exclusively to their people, not to foreign coffers. Because until this fundamental restructuring of power takes place, the vicious cycle of dependence will not only continue, it will imprison the continent.